What's up guys, it's Brad from Light Architect. In this video, I'm going to be doing a 3D scene and compositing breakdown of the main window explosion created for our recently updated Khaos add-on for Blender 3D trailer. As usual, this 3D scene and compositing breakdown is not really a tutorial, but should give you some ideas on how you can utilize this add-on as well as the compositing techniques we use with it in order to create some interesting looking results on your own visual effects projects. We are really excited to have released this update for the Khaos add-on for you guys, so we hope you enjoy it as well as the tutorials we create for it in the future on this channel. Anyways guys, without further ado, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. This is our general scene setup. This shot was very simple to create. The first thing I did for this shot was track our footage. So as you can see here, I've just added a few points here to track our building in the live action shot. And I've just tracked through our scene here. I have a solve error of 1.90, which is enough to reconstruct the general environment in 3D. I didn't actually use this track when rendering the explosion elements. I just wanted to use it to create a general reconstruction of the environment so that I could create a more realistic looking explosion coming from the windows. So I've just solved our camera here, and as you can see inside of our layout mode, I've just kind of reconstructed the building here in 3D using some basic cubes here. So you can see I've just created some geometry to represent the building in our live action shot. And I've actually made this building geometry a collision object for fluids so that it would actually interact with our explosion simulation when we create it utilizing our new Khaos emitters and MantaFlow. So I've just made it a very basic collision effector here so that it would interact with our fluid and just created a really basic kind of outline of our scene. As you can see, if we go to our camera view, this is our tracked camera. And you can see I've just created some windows for our explosion to blast out of. And once I created this general geometry of our scene, I then added some Khaos emitters to create our explosion. So that's what we have here. I actually created two different smoke domains for this specific shot. I created a gasoline style explosion with one emitter, and then I created one here called the tracer system, which contains some more skinny emitters, blasting out some kind of less dense, lighter looking smoke. So this is one of the ways that I like to make an explosion look more realistic, is actually combining different domains with different emitters and then having different colors of smoke, which is a lot more accurate to what an explosion in the real world would look like. So you have a lot of different types of explosions and debris and smoke, and we want to try to emulate that in our simulation as much as possible. And then in the compositing process, we can layer in all those different elements and even add some live action dust or fire elements in there as well if you find it necessary. So go ahead and show you guys our initial gas explosion system here. So I have this first explosion system that I've just added with our Khaos Detonator add-on here. And I'll go ahead and just kind of go through this emitter for you real quick. You can see I've animated the emission value, and actually our emitter is pretty small here. I made the gauge here fairly low. It's 0.15, so you can see I could actually increase this. I've also made the displacement a lot as well. You can see kind of the general idea here, but I've actually made the emitter gauge fairly low, and I just brought up the displacement strength because I just wanted this to be more of a debris-like explosion. So I've just animated the emission value of this blast to come out here, and I've just animated it over 10 frames actually to go from 0 to 2, and that's what's just creating this general initial blast here. And pretty basic setup. I have 8 little explosion counts here, but of course we could increase this and make it a lot more. But yeah, I have an emitter angle of 9.3, a little bit of angle randomness there. And the main thing that I changed after getting the general shape of this explosion with all of these different parameters was the fluid velocity. I brought this down to 0.1 at its default. This is at 1, which makes the smoke blast out much more violently from the emitter. But since the emitter's moving fairly quickly already, I wanted to just have that smoke moving at about 10% of the initial speed of our blast. I've also brought down the fuel amount a little bit to 0.65, so there'll be a little bit less smoke in this original explosion. And when it comes to these parameters, guys, a lot of it is about kind of experimenting once you get an initial simulation. So you kind of create the general shape of your explosion with an emitter, and then go ahead and bake that with fairly low resolution division so you can do it very quickly. And then once you get a starting point of what your system is looking like, you can decide what parameters you want to change. So for example, if your smoke is moving too quickly away from that initial blast, blast, you can bring down your fluid velocity so it doesn't quite move as quickly. Or if you want to shape your smoke very specifically, you can, increase your emitter gauge to just create a larger initial blast. Or if you just want more smoke or more fire, you can increase the fuel amount. So there are a lot of different things you can change here. Even change the explosion count way up here. I find that actually having a smaller explosion count is a little bit nicer than just cranking it up a lot here, because this can start to all kind of blend together and doesn't quite look as good in my opinion. Of course, it depends on what exactly you're trying to create, but I actually find that generally decreasing the emitter gauge and having a smaller explosion count, your smoke still tends to kind of mold together as the simulation continues throughout the scene. But my recommendation is to try an emitter that looks like the kind of explosion you want to set up, bake it out with a lower number of resolution divisions, something like 64 or 96, and then see if you need to up-res it from there, but try to stay around 96 or 128 grid resolutions. And then if you like the way it looks, you can up-res it with that high resolution noise, which I've shown in the quick start video utilizing Khaos. So I'll put a link to that in the description below. But I have a lot more tutorials coming with Khaos. Let's continue with this breakdown. So I just have a very basic emitter system here. Once I created this original explosion, I then baked it out here. So I'll go ahead and turn our smoke on. This is our simulation that we have created with that emitter. And you can see the smoke and fire actually look pretty decent here. I'll go ahead and turn on our background once again. This background building geometry is actually a holdout, so it will hide the explosion parts that are within the building, if that makes sense. I have a whole video on holdouts, so I'll put that in the description. But yeah, this is the original simulation domain. And if we go here a little further in the timeline, you can kind of see how it dissipates here. It's not a perfect simulation, but if we combine it with our tracer system that we add later, it looks pretty good. So there's some pretty decent resolution on it from the angle that we shot at. So I decided to go with it after experimenting a few times. If you really want a lot of resolution on your smoke and fire, you can definitely increase your high resolution. As you can see here, we up-res this gas domain by 3. You can see it without the up-res really quick. It looks, very low resolution here. But the point of the initial bake here is to get the general shape of the explosion, and then you bake the high resolution noise on top of it to get the fire detail. So if we want to get more detail, we can play around with these settings and experiment a bit and really dial in the look that we want. So that was the initial bake. That was kind of the gasoline style explosion. I usually try to combine a fiery explosion with some kind of smaller dust debris, like I mentioned earlier. So as you can see here, we have a tracer system that I've added. So I'll go ahead and turn off our gas explosion system. So this here is our second Khaos emitter. And you can see it's just a much smaller and slower moving emitter. And if we just combine these together, go ahead and combine them real quick. If we combine them together, you can see we have some thicker explosions. And then if we turn off the gas explosion, we have this smaller one here. And this is just to create those smaller streaks. So I call them tracers, but you can see they go out much further than the shorter blast here. So you can see just from the empties that represent where that explosion mesh is going, that it's going out much further. So you can see when we combine all these together, we get kind of an initial blast from our gasoline explosion, and then those tracers come out afterwards and they kind of linger a little bit. So that was the second step here. I baked this tracer domain. So I'll go ahead and show you guys that by itself here. I'll select this domain, and I'll actually make a tutorial on how you can utilize separate domains to create a more realistic looking explosion. But yeah, here we go. So you can see here, this is kind of our dust blast that we've created to add some lighter smoke to our main gasoline explosion. And the reason I'm calling it a gasoline explosion is because the fire lingers a bit. This one is more of just a smoke simulation. So you can see here, if we turn on both of these domains together, we get a combined look that looks pretty nice here. You can see that gasoline explosion kind of brings everything together. Let me just turn off the gasoline explosion initially. We'll take a look at the tracer explosion. The resolution is pretty good on this. Let's see, the resolution was 160 resolution divisions initially. So I'm getting even smaller scale detail before we bake that high resolution noise on top of it. Essentially, this number, this resolution divisions on your domain is going to tell how many voxels within your domain cube. But you can see I've actually brought down the up-res factor, even though I've done more initial resolution divisions. So that's how you can kind of create some smaller tracer rounds. And if you want them even smaller, you can bring up the resolution divisions even more. And then theoretically, you don't have to bake as much up-res noise on top of that. So this is the general idea here. You can tell that I've actually made the color of the smoke a little bit different here as well. And combining the lighter color for the tracers with the darker colors of the gasoline style smoke, you can get a much more realistic blast. So we'll go ahead and turn on the gas domain here, and we can see what both of these domains look like together. You can see the various colors kind of combined together end up looking really nice here. So this is kind of the general idea here. Now, of course, we could bake more noise on top of this. There's a lot we can do here, but you can see the different colors of smoke are doing a lot for us. And if we turn our background back on, it'll act as a holdout, and you get a pretty nice looking window explosion system here. So pretty nice little initial result. If I were to do this again in the future, I'd probably try to get these tracer rounds a little bit skinnier. And to do that, I would just increase the initial resolution divisions on that domain cube and then up-res it by less. So pretty nice looking system here though, guys. You can see it from different angles. To light this explosion, I've just added 2 different area lights as well as a very basic HDRI. I highly recommend you add some area lights hitting your smoke, because with any kind of volumetrics, it really helps to add light that can bounce around the smoke. And I also recommend when you do your rendering that you increase your volume bounces to at least 1, if not 2. Now, of course, that depends on the power of your machine and how long you want to render something for, but I find that helps get a better looking result, as your light will bounce around the smoke and make it look more realistic. Okay, so this is the general idea on how I created the 2 smoke caches for this simulation. Pretty basic setup here, guys. Just 2 customized emitters from Khaos used in those different domains. One more thing I added to this explosion to make it even more realistic was, of course, some debris fields using our Khaos legacy presets here. So you can see if I just turn on this collection right here, we get some really nice looking cinder blocks and small scale glass blasting out of the window with our simulation. So I'll go ahead and turn off our gas and tracer systems here, and you can see kind of the general idea of the types of emitters that I'm adding here. I'm adding this glass emitter to emit those small scale particles coming out of the window, as well as the 3D scan concrete. And I'm just doing this with our legacy add-on. I've added the glass particles and the concrete particles. And this is a really simple system you can set up. These debris fields are simple particle systems that are preset into Khaos, and you just add them into your scene and adjust them within your particle settings tab here. You can see I have 220 concrete particles. I've baked this all out. And then for the glass system, I have 1300 glass particles blasting out. And you can see I have these glass particles kind of inside of our building structure too. And the reason for that is because I've made our building structure once again a collision object as well as a fluid collision object. So any kind of particles will also interact with this proxy building so that we'll get a more realistic looking simulation. So you can see if I just play through this really quickly, the glass actually tries to blast toward the right here, but since there's an actual structure here, it's only going out the window. And this is how you can create a more organic look for your debris fields. You actually just build the geometry of the scene, and then you emit particles and let it naturally interact. So I've done the same thing here with the brick particles, or the concrete, I should say. Go ahead and close our window here. You can see it bounces off too. So pretty simple little setup. That's how I created the debris fields. I've rendered out the glass particles as well as the concrete debris separately so that we can composite them all inside of After Effects. And then finally, I've rendered out the smoke and fire simulation on a separate view layer as well. And with that smoke and fire simulation, since the fire was emitting light, I rendered out an emission pass. So you can see here, I'm saying to render out an emission pass, and I've exported this data so that we can have really good control over that fire and just isolate where that fire is in the render and add glow only to that. And this is really important when you're creating explosions inside of Blender or any other software, to render out your emission pass separately so you can have more control over those flames and other emissive objects. So anyways, I've rendered that out here. I did a little test here, as you can see, but I've just exported the files separately here straight from the render layers. Again, I've rendered out the glass, the concrete, and the fire and smoke all separately. And then again, I've also exported an emission pass of the fire on the smoke to have more complete control in the compositing process. And one more thing you'll probably notice is that there's only one explosion in the scene that I've showed you, and there are actually 3 explosions in the final shot. And what I actually did is I've just rendered out the same explosion from different angles and then composited that into our live action shot within After Effects. So you can see here that I actually have 3 different cameras. So I'm rendering out different angles of the explosion. So you can see if I just go to our scene properties tab here, I can switch the camera to render cam. You can see I've rendered from this angle, and then our second camera, I've rendered it from this angle. And even though they're the same explosion, I can get away with compositing them in the same shot and actually get a pretty decent looking result. So again, I've just rendered out the same explosion from 2 different angles and comped them into the shot inside of After Effects. So let's get inside of After Effects and I'll show you guys how I composited everything together. Alright guys, here we are inside of After Effects, and this is our final composite for this triple window explosion shot. As you can see here, we've composited in our explosions as well as our debris fields with our concrete and glass debris systems. And we've also added some nice glow using our emission paths. And then you'll probably notice that we've also added some dust elements to bring everything together and make it more realistic instead of our final composite as well. So I'll go ahead and just play through our final shot here, and then I'll just go through the process of layering all the different elements as well as the effects to bring everything together. So go ahead and just play through our scene here. This is our final shot, and as you can see, pretty nice looking simulations here. You'll notice that each explosion looks a little bit different, and I've done a variety of things here. First of all, as I mentioned, I rendered out the same explosion from 2 different angles, and then of course I could flip those explosions horizontally and place them into our scene, and then we could actually get away with using the same explosion but providing a lot more variation, which helps sell the fact that they're actually different simulations. So this is our final shot. As you can see, the flames are looking pretty awesome here. I'm actually showing this at half resolution just so we can render everything a bit better, but I'll just go through the layers one by one here. The first layer that we have is our live action shot. I've tracked our live action shot, so you can see this little null object here is just a track that we have, made for adding our explosions so that they would match the movement of our camera. As I mentioned, even though I 3D tracked my camera inside of Blender, I didn't actually render out those elements with that track. So I'm actually tracking inside the compositor and then layering on those elements, applying that tracking data in the compositor. So I've just made this very basic track here so that I could link all the elements that I'm adding to this shot to this track. Then the first element that I added was our actual explosion beauty pass render. So I'll just go ahead and turn them on here. And you'll notice that the black levels of these explosions aren't matching entirely, but that's because I'm matching the element with all the other elements added on top of it. So I've just utilized some effects to blend them into the final shot as well. But I'll go ahead and turn off some of those really quick. You can see our window blast right here. If I turn off our curves effect that I've added, as well as our tint and directional blur effect, here we have our basic render, again at half resolution here. But you can see I've added to each of these explosions a curves effect to lift the shadows to match those black levels a bit more. Then I've also added a tint effect, and I found that tinting the explosion, specifically the white values, toward the color of the background of your plate helps to integrate that explosion to the live action shot a bit better, because it's almost as if the light bounce from the live action shot is interacting with that explosion. So you can see if I bring this all the way up what it's doing, but just a little before and after there. So I think tint is one of the best effects you can use to integrate your explosions into your scene. Then I've also added some directional blur keyframe to increase at the moment of the explosion. So you can see here when I turn that on, it's actually at 0 right now because that's the end of its burst. But if we go around here, you can see it a bit more. So just adding a little bit more of a violent feel to the blast. So here we have our color corrected gasoline elements that we've added to our scene. And again, I know the black levels are off, but we're just matching those to the final shot with all the other elements added. Matter of fact, I'll just turn them off here for a second, just so you guys can get the right idea. So now we can see the explosions without those effects added. They look like this. Actually, by themselves here, just on top of the plate, they look much better without those effects. But once we integrate everything, we're gonna need that color correction. So we'll go ahead and turn these back on here. So we've just lifted those shadows a bit with the curves effect, brought the explosion into the plate a bit better with the tint, and then added some blur with the directional blur effect to get this look here. Now the next thing that I overlaid on top of each explosion was its corresponding emission pass. So as you can see here, if I turn these on, you'll notice that we get the glow on the flames, and that's because I'm taking the emission pass, I'm adding some glow as well as some directional blur to it. So you can see if I turn that off, we'll get the emission pass by itself. That is just adding the brightness to the flames. So I've done that to each explosion here. Just overlaid that on top of each explosion in our scene. and that's also adding our glow on top of everything as well. And I've added 2 different glow effects to these emission passes because we want to add an isolated glow on the brightest parts of the fire, and then we want to add a general glow to kind of light up the environment around the explosion as well. So we have 2 different glows at different radiuses to integrate our explosion into the scene, and this is what our emission pass looks like without the actual explosion behind it. You can see our emission pass by itself, again with those effects added. And by isolating this pass, we can have a lot more individual control over the fire in the scene. Alright, so after adding the beauty passes of our explosions, as well as the corresponding emission pass, it was then time to layer the debris field elements on top of everything. So the first thing I layered was our glass debris field. So as you can see here, I have a variety of duplicated glass debris fields. I'll go ahead and just turn them on here really quickly. You can see I've actually utilized multiple versions of the glass debris field here. And I'm actually just using one specific render of glass, and I'm just duplicating it and kind of having it blast out from different directions because I found that the original render wasn't quite enough to get the amount of particles that I wanted. I could have just gone back into Blender and rendered out more glass particles, but rather than doing that, I just duplicated it many times and then layered them onto different parts of the explosion, using masks to tell Blender where to have the glass show up. So as you can see here on the right side, we have our glass debris fields now being blasted out, which look quite nice. And I've rendered these glass particles out with a little bit of motion blur, so I didn't add any effects to these glass particles. I did have some masks to tell After Effects where to not show a certain rendered element, so I did do a little bit of masking on a few of these glass elements. And again, I feathered these masks to make sure that a specific element was integrated into its part of the explosion. So that's what I've done there. The next thing that I did was add our concrete brick debris field. So as you can see here, I'll just turn our brick debris fields on. I think this really helps to sell the effect. So you can see specifically this guy right here is helping to integrate our right window here. I really think this guy's doing a good job creating the impact of the explosion, just kind of blasting out of the window here. And I've added a variety of different color correction effects on top of the brick debris fields here. The main one being the curves effect because it was a little bit too bright. And then finally some hue and saturation here to bring in the colors a bit more. So you can see our bricks are a little bit too dark here. So I actually brought up the general levels here with an RGB curves. And then I brought down the green and blue levels since those colors were a little bit too saturated. So I just brought down the green and blue curves here. Then I've also gone and added a hue and saturation effect to just bring down the general saturation of our bricks here. And then also just increase the relative lightness. And by increasing this master lightness, you're also lifting the shadows a bit, which again, since there would be bounce from the surrounding environment, kind of helps to integrate them into the shot even further. So you can see kind of before and after with the hue and saturation effect here, what that's going to do. And I really think these bricks help to integrate our explosion into the shot. Once I added and did a little bit of masking work on our bricks debris field, it was time to add some final real life dust elements into our scene to integrate the CG into the live action plate a bit more. As I mentioned earlier in this video, it's important to have a variety of different colors of smoke and debris to make everything feel a little bit more organic. So that's what adding these final layers of dust and debris help to do. So you can see all these different elements right here. I have some dust falling elements, which I've added into the scene, as well as some dust waves, which are a little bit bigger. So I've added some on the top here as well as on the bottom. I'll go ahead and turn on all these. You can see I've actually added some kind of dust falling elements by the windows just after the explosion occurs, and even some up here. So you can see if I kind of turn off our actual plate, all the other dust elements that I've added to help integrate the CG explosion into the shot a bit better. You can see the kind of the dust falling from the windows, and then of course the dust shockwave elements as well. So this is helping just to integrate that CG into the live action further, because these are actual live action elements. And again, by having that varying color in the actual smoke and fire, it's just going to help to add a little bit more realism to the shot. And one of the things I try to do here when I'm compositing a shot is actually start at a large scale level of detail and then work into the smaller scale detail. So for example, I'm starting out with the biggest elements like the explosions, then I'm adding the debris particles to help integrate that explosion, and then finally I'm adding the finer dust elements as the last step of small scale detail to help really sell the impact of the explosion. I think that's a great way to think about things, is just kind of start at the large scale and get down to the details. And that's what I kind of do when I'm sketching out a scene and compositing a shot together. And here you can see the shot with the dust elements. And finally, as the last step to integrate this shot into the scene, I've added some lens droplets on top of everything. And you can see it is just isolated right by the explosion. And that's because I'm actually using an explosion as the lumimat to drive our lens droplets. So you can see if I just turn these off for a second, what I'm actually using to drive our lens droplets is our explosion, but with all these different effects added to it. So I'm adding a bunch of effects to it to make it much brighter. And then I'm using this brightness data via a lumimat on these lens droplets to drive where the lens droplets show up. So you can see this lens droplet element by itself, it looks like this, but then within the composite, we get something like this because it's only showing up where the bright spots of this explosion are telling it to. So that was the cherry on top for this explosion. You can see it kind of integrating our CG into the plate even further. You've probably seen this in video games or a lot of action movies try to do this, but it's just one more way to promote a little bit of realism. I think it's kind of a nice way to add some grunge to the final image if you want an explosive result. Then of course, I've added a little final color grade on top of everything to help bring all of the elements together as well as the live action plate. So this is our final explosion with all of our different elements. I'm fairly happy with the results. I could have up-resed our smoke and fire by one more up-res factor, but overall it looks pretty good. I hope you guys enjoyed this breakdown. That is it for this video. I hope it was helpful. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what you'd like to learn next on the channel. Subscribe for more visual effects and filmmaking content, and I'll see you next time.